Greetings, and welcome to another video from odooclass.com. In this video, we're going to take a look at a common enhancement that you would add to an installation of Odoo to customize it, and that is field level security and field level visibility of certain information. Now, what I mean by that is that there might be certain records or certain views in which you want a certain group of employees or users to be able to see, and then you have another group of users that maybe you don't want them to have access to that information or to be able to view that information. So we do have other videos that talk a little bit about access rights, and there's Odoo Essentials goes into that, and I will link at the bottom of this page our other video on access rights. But we're going to begin by looking a little bit just at what the basic access rights are, and we do this always by turning on our technical features. We're beginning with a brand new version of Odoo. There's no real prerequisites for this video. You should probably generally know your way around Odoo, but I'm going to start with just kind of giving you a little bit of a look at the basic way that you have security applied. And the basic way that security is applied by model. And if I click on this access control list, you'll see what I mean. If I look down the list of particular rules here, and you'll notice there's only 142 of them. The access control list allows you to specify read, write, create, and delete permissions on various actions. And since we haven't really installed any modules yet, this is just a base system, you're basically limited to what you see. Let's see if we can get to res.partner. Maybe it wants res_partner. And yeah, if I put res_partner, you'll see that for the res partner groups, this is defining what groups have access on what models within the system. It's all handled at the model level. So for example, the res partner group public control group says that the partner object has public read access. In other words, that this object can be read. And if I click on it, I could change the group. And so this is inline editing here. If you don't know what you're doing with these, be careful, because you can cause a lot of abnormal behavior by modifying access rights on these base groups. And so basically you have a group, and you have what object, meaning model. So in this case, partner, which is really res.partner. And then of course what group is assigned to this object, and then the permissions it gets. So you'll notice the portal and the public both have the same permissions. They both just have read access. But the group partner manager group for content creation, if you're part of the content creation group, if you're part of this content creation group, you have the ability to read, write, create, and delete records. And you'll notice down here under employee resources that you have read access as long as you're a user. As long as you're part of this user group, you have to have read access. And that makes sense, because at the model level, if you're a user in the system, you're going to need access to that data. So one distinction to remember is that sometimes data that needs to be accessible at the model level in order for Odoo to properly operate and present and to function might not be visible to the same group at the view level. In other words, the portal users have read access to the partner object, but certainly you're not going to give them access at the public level, or this public group necessarily access to the emails, or for obviously people's logons and passwords. Those you have to decide how you're going to define your views. And so a general rule and an access rule you can think of, and this is kind of just something from my experience implementing ERP systems, is that the more access that's allowed at the model level, the more you need to be concerned about restricting and limiting what happens at the view level. And when possible, you always want to put your restrictions at the model level. So in other words, if you can keep a particular group, like in this case the res partner group user, they've only got read access. We don't want to give them write and create and delete access, because this group, the employee group, does not need to have any reason to write, create, or delete on this object. However, the manager of this particular group, you'll notice that's if they're part of the content creation, and this is what's important. This is what we're naming the group, and then this is basically the object, group, and associated access that goes with it. So this is a bit of a review if you've already understood record level access and model level access. These groups that we defined here, and one of the ones we're going to be looking at, will be some of the manager groups for HR in our example. But these groups tell Odoo what models can be accessed. Now, under security, you'll also have record rules. And what record rules mean is if you look at this access controls list, it's not telling you specifically which records these groups have access to. In other words, it's saying that the portal here group has access to all of the partner records. There's no restriction. It could be within any domain of that record group within this model, and that includes employees, that includes customers, that includes suppliers. So at the model level, this read access right here, lets a lot of data through, considering that basically by this definition you have full access to the partner record. So naturally, Odoo does what it needs to do when it's displaying views, and you use views to restrict what is visible to the end user of the portal or public information. But what records rules do, in contrast to these rules apply to the whole modules. Record rules, and we'll go ahead and say we want to leave this page, record rules actually apply on each record. So let's look at an example of like the currency rule. What this means is that, or maybe we're better off maybe looking at, let's find a rule that's real simple, like this filters rule. And basically what this means is when it applies this record rule, it's going to check to make sure that the user ID is either false or that it has a matching user ID. So essentially what these domain filters get applied on every record of this object. And we're gonna see how this works a little bit more clearly when we install more modules. So let's go ahead and start up our example that we want here by installing the employee directory. So I'm gonna just go to employee directory and install. And for our example, for field level access, now that we've kind of reviewed how we put restrictions on the full object, so if we wanted to restrict groups to having access to specific models, or we wanted to restrict users to having access to records. And that's let's go back down here once again. I don't want to really jump off this topic too quickly until we see a few of the other things that come in here once I have installed the employee directory. But you'll notice that a lot of these things are like, HR department, that it'll check for things that company ID equaling false, or that the company ID is the child of another company ID. So these kind of domain record rules typically, as you can see, a lot of times are involving multi company operations, making sure that when you're looking at a company that you can also see the child and the children companies underneath them. For example, it says company ID is a child of the user of the company's the ID that the user's of, and so that meaning that this user that's looking at these records is part of those companies, is one of either the company itself or a child company. So again, these apply record by record by record, but they do nothing to address fields. And one other distinction I'm going to make is access control lists by default are limiting. In other words, an object by default does not give permission. And these rules in this access control list, you can see there's 187 of them now, they give and provide additional rights to objects. So by default, if you create a model, and then we'll use one for an example here because we're going to use this employee one as an example. By default, nobody's going to have access to this employee object. So this record, HR employee user that we create, gives access to the employee object for officers, and officers can in the officers groups can read, write, create, and delete against the employee object. Users can only read the employee object, and there should be a manager in here somewhere, and they would also be able to add and delete and do all the operations on the object. So by default, you don't have access to the full entire model until you provide a record here, as you can see. So officer, employee, in this particular, to look at the categories or to look at users, you can see here specifically what permissions they have. And if there were no permissions on the employee object provided in this access control list, then nobody would have access to the employee object. In contrast, the record rules actually allow all the records unless you put a rule in here that is denying essentially those records. And then once this rule is applied, then these are the records that get applied for those particular groups. So if a user is not part of these groups, then those particular record rules would not apply. You'll want to experiment yourself so you completely understand what I'm telling you here, but the basic rule is that access control lists are by default adding permissions, and that the state of the objects are denying access otherwise unless they're in this list, whereas the record rules are getting, if you don't have them, you get everything, and when they are applied, they're applied specifically across the domain that you provide here and the object you provide. And then basically at that point, whenever this domain is satisfied, it's going to apply these permissions. If this domain is not satisfied, you're still going to have the same exact access that you would have had by what was set up in here. Okay, so that's enough of everything to do with record level and object level permissions. Let's look at now some real examples of how we can apply this and see what happens as users, and then we're going to look at an example of how we can do field level control, where we can decide for a given user group what fields they can access on the screen. So for our example, let's look at employees and let's look at our administrator. And you'll notice here on administrator there's personal information, and we've got some rather sensitive information. And I'm using this as a specific example because it's good to have good examples, and oftentimes human resources is one of the areas where people want to have a lot of control over the permissions they have on what users can see what. And for example, you might have supervisors out in your plant. You want them to have quite a bit of information, but maybe they don't really need to see somebody's bank account number. You know, they don't need to see that as maybe a team leader out in the departments, but yet there's other information they'd want to see, and perhaps maybe like, you know, identification number or bank account number, something you only want to be seen by the manager. Now, by default, however, this is visible to more than just the manager. Anybody who is part of the HR department can see everything here. And there's more than a few specific business requirements I've had where an HR department will hire a temporary employee or somebody to come in to put in data to do some work on accounts, and they don't really need those people to see all this information. So let's see what that means. If I go here to users, I'm going to create two users for example. I'm going to create an HR user, and this is someone that it works in HR. Perhaps they check time sheets. Perhaps they are involved with fulfilling leave request approvals, or maybe they're involved with various functionality, but they don't need the most sensitive data. So we're just going to call this person HR user for our test, HR user. And so down here under our human resources, you notice we got employee, officer, and manager. Now, employee is a non-HR function. That's just people that are working for the company. So this is not who we're targeting as this HR user. In fact, let's name this HR officer so we have consistency here. And so we'll make this an HR officer, and they're going to have access, as you'll see, to a lot of information. So we have HR officer, and we got to spell that right if we're going to get back in. And so we're just going to give them that status and save. And we're going to create another user, HR manager, and we'll call them HR manager to keep everything consistent for our test. And we're going to make them a manager. And so naturally, the goal here is that we want HR managers to have greater permissions and more specific permissions than our HR officer. So let's go and double check that we've got this right. HR officer at test.com. I'm going to go up here and throw a quick password, just test in there. And I'm going to do the same thing for our HR manager. There's no reason why they have to have different passwords. I'm just setting this up for a test. So we have a manager and we have an officer. So now let's log out and log in as that officer. So we're going to quickly log back in, and we're going to go here, and let's assume that this HR officer, we just hired them, and they can go to the administrator, the CEO of the company, or anyone and see important information. Passport number does not need to be seen by this person. And neither does identification number, maybe. So what we're doing here is we're providing a real world example as to field level security, and security should be used in context of saying that, you know, we're preventing the user from seeing this data, from easily editing it, and that you know you're going to need to double check all your processes, because Odoo's model level security that's provided there, as you saw, is at the entire model level, and it's at the record level. To have field level, we're going to override it here. Now we can create functional modules that can create field level security, and we're going to look into some of those solutions. What we're doing here is we're taking this piece right here to show a simple example of how we can prevent identification number from being seen by this HR officer. So we want, for our example, we'll say we want the HR officer to be able to manage this data, but we want to arbitrarily say perhaps there's 4 or 5 fields we don't want them to be able to see and to manage. And one of the ones we're going to target this time, it will be, let's just go ahead and do passport number. Okay, so passport number, we're going to, and we could go ahead and do identification number at the same time. We don't want these to be seen by the officer of the company. We only want them to be seen by the manager. Okay, so the first thing, like we've done in a lot of other videos you'll see, is we want to get the field names that we need to use here. So I'm going to go to About, Odoo, and go to our developer mode. And go to our personal information. I'm going to mouse over this, and I'll see that that's identification underscore ID. That's passport underscore ID. So these are our 2 fields that we want to hide. Now, the nice thing about Odoo is that we're going to be able to make this change quickly and easily. I'm given my standard warning: when you modify your database, document your changes, especially as they relate to access and security. Back up your database often. Don't work on a live database, especially when you're new to changing settings. Access settings, access security falls into somewhat of a gray area, in my opinion, as to whether or not you should write modules and create standalone Python driven solutions that you would install to configure this and to hide these. In other words, it's very possible, if you've watched our OpenERP Developer Volume 1, OpenERP Developer Volume 2, to make this change using a module that would then persist across any database that you install that module on, to hide and to change these permissions. There's certainly nothing wrong with that approach, and there's a certain robustness, especially if you're a company in the position of supporting an installation. It's in your benefit to have a very reusable way to apply a large set of modifications to a database, because as you're making modifications, it's not just going to be, oh well, we want to change and hide identification number and passport number. You're going to end up with dozens, and sometimes you might even get into the hundreds of little small changes like this that you'll make to adapt and align an Odoo installation for a production environment. You need a way to document what you do. You need a way to make sure you know that you've made this base change and that you've overridden this group. I mean, that's at a minimum. However, putting it into a module and having that kind of persistence is not always the best solution, given the difficulty and the inability for IT integrators and people perhaps that want to deploy to the cloud and have limited access to deploy Python modules. So if you're going to deploy this in the cloud and you don't expect to have a great deal of flexibility of stopping and starting servers and making changes in Python code and actually, setting permissions on directories and things like that, then make the changes in the database and document your changes. And I'm saying that before we actually make the changes. To deny access to these fields to the group that's currently logged in, which is this case the HR officer. We're going to make it so these fields are only accessible by the manager. So how do we do that? We can go up under here, and you'll notice that because I'm logged in as HR officer, I can view fields, I can get fields and manage filters. There's some things I can do, but I'm very restricted because I'm not logged in as an admin. So to make our changes, we need to log in as an admin. And we're going to now show exactly how you set up the field so that you have field level control over this. We're going to go back into About Odoo and activate developer mode. We're going to go here under our debug view and edit our form view. And in our form view is where the view describes, exactly how it's going to appear to the user. And one of the fields that you're going to see on a lot of these is groups. It's an attribute of the field tag here. So as this form is getting processed, you'll notice that we have notebook for public information here, and we have a notebook for personal information. As we get down here, you'll see country ID, you'll see identification ID, passport, and then the bank account ID and so forth. Now notice out here on passport ID and identification ID that the groups that are assigned to this are simply the base dot group HR underscore user. Now what we want to do is we don't want just the users to be able to have access to this. Instead, we want to restrict this to only being available to the manager. So I'm going to just change this to manager. So I wanted to give you in this video enough background so that you could do your security at the level that's most appropriate for your requirements. So obviously if you can block at the model level, that's where you want to do it if you don't need to give someone access to the whole entire model. If you have to give people access to the model, then maybe you can use record rules to limit access so they only can see certain records. But sometimes you're going to need field level control, and that's where this comes in, is that you can go to any field name in your view, and using this groups tag you can limit this to just these groups, and you can just separate the groups by commas inside the groups to have as many groups as you want. And I should maybe correct myself, you might need to create a tuple of groups, but this groups attribute here is now changed to be manager. So let's save this. And we didn't get any errors, and I believe if we really broke that view and provided a group that was bad, we would have gotten an XML architecture error. But you'll notice that we still see the identification and passport. We're still seeing this data. And why are we seeing this? Well, we're seeing this because we're logged in as administrator. So let's log out, log back in as our HR officer. And now watch what happens when we go here. Our identification ID and our passport's gone, made invisible and unable to be seen by the HR officer because the HR officer is not a member of the manager group, and only the manager groups have access to see that field. Now let's test our manager to make sure they can see it. We know the admin can see it, but let's test this one out just to make sure. Our HR manager logs in, has a request. Somebody wants to see that all important passport information or identification, and you'll see there it is. So for the manager, they can log in, they can see these fields, log out, HR officer, fields are invisible. They can't see that data, can't get to it. So that shows you how you can do field level security on your views. You're going to want to practice this, but it's applicable to any object you have on your views or any forms. As you can see, it's relatively simple. A base requirement is just making sure you really understand this base level security first and this access control list. Make sure you take time to click on the groups here and realize that here are your groups. So anybody that you want to be a human resource manager, now that you want to be able to see that information, needs to be put under here. And if you'll notice here in the groups, if I look at who our officers are, you'll see that the manager is listed in both. And you might ask yourself, well, why is that? And the officer, the manager is actually inheriting from the officer. So if we go here and look at the manager group, and I look at the inherited, you'll see this, that the manager group inherits from the officer. And it might seem kind of backwards to you, but in permissions related inheritance, the least restrictive is like the base. And then as you get more restrictive, you inherit from that. So you have a base user. The base user gets the employee inherits from that. Then the officer inherits, from the employee. And then finally, the manager inherits from the officer to give the most access and the most permissions that are available. So there is no specific access rights here under manager, because the officer here, and I think I can click on this, has already obtained all of the possible model rights available. So an officer in this case has all the complete rights. However, the manager has additional permissions that are provided above and beyond just basic access rights to the models. If I look at we can also look and double check just to make sure there's no rules as well. And you can keep going up the line. So officer inherits from employee. Employee doesn't inherit from anything in this case. We look at all the access rights that someone of this base group has. And then you can also see all the rules that are applied as well. And everything just kind of stacks on top of that, where the officer is inheriting from the employee and the manager inherits from the officer, adding additional menu options, adding additional views possibly, but certainly we were able to go into that view and change it so only this manager and not the officer has rights. So hopefully this video covered a little more than I expected. I really just was going to jump in and go right into the field, overriding, but I think it was important to maybe just review the context, because I think if someone was, really struggling here to know how to change this, it's probably a good idea, to really understand your access rights in your groups and model level configuration first, and then as we build on that, as you can see, it's real easy to go into your views and just say, here are the groups that can see and have access to that field. So with that said, if there's any questions, please write me. I know there's more we can do with permissions and more granularity. So we'll explore that in later videos. But I think this covered quite a bit of ground, and hopefully now you can go out there and restrict your views to show what you want for the groups that you want to see them. So with that said, take care, and thanks for watching.